My name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
And welcome to another episode of Ray's Economics Cluebook. Today, talking about market structure and oligopoly.
Okay.
So, what is oligopoly? Oligopoly is basically where you have a very few or small number of firms that control an industry or control a vast majority of industry. And essentially, they're as a result, they have massive pricing power. They're obviously price takers, not other price makers, not price takers. And so, even more so than previously talked about monopolistic competition. Pricing. So they have great pricing powers, but they're also price interdependent, or they're interdependent on each other, which means that their behavior, or their pricing behavior, or their production behavior is dependent on the behavior of their competitors in the firm, because there's so few competitors. And so with that, since they're independent, there's also a possibility of collusion. A collusion, basically, where they all collude to determine how much output is going to be produced at what price in order to maximize each other's profits. Of course, with collusion also comes the possibility of cheating in the collusion, which creates a whole other logical issue. But that's another story. Product differentiation, like monopoly competition, they are all differentiated some way or somehow in order to better compete with each other, since there are so few firms in the industry. And as a result, it's pretty hard to have oligopoly competition with very little differentiation. Barriers to entry, because there's so few firms because of these barriers, or else there'll be more firms. And it's measured basically by its 5-firm ratio, usually is above 50%. That's the very rough estimate of what makes it oligopoly.
Yeah, oligopoly is actually very common in the United States. If you look at for example, soft drink, right? We only probably have 3 players: Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper. But if you look at big market like food industry, there are just top 3 players like Nestle, like Pepsi, like Kraft Heinz. They control pretty much about more than 25% of the market already.
So the HHI, or Hirschman Index, is a very good way to objectively measure how consolidated an industry is, and objectively maybe determine if an industry is an oligopoly. So basically, what it does is you take the market share by percentage for each firm in the industry, and then you square it and you multiply it by the number of firms in the industry. And so let's say for a monopoly, right? In monopoly, you have one firm that controls 100% market share, so its HAI index is 1 times 100 squared, which equals 10,000. For a duopoly, or industry of 2 firms, your market share is 50% each. You have 2 firms, so your HHI index is 2 times 50 squared, which is 2,500 times 2, which is 5,000. For a perfectly competitive industry, for instance, we say with 10,000 firms, each firm is equal in controlling 0.01% of the industry. The HAI index is 10,000 times 0.01 squared, which is 1. And one marks theoretically a perfectly competitive industry. Usually, if the HAI index, or the sum of the square market shares by percentage, is greater than or equal to 1,000, that constitutes an oligopoly.
It's a sum of the square of the market shares, as they just showed the example. It's pretty simple, but it really showed how market is concentrated. How much concentration it is. The higher, the more concentrated.
So for a prime example in the United States is basically like network providers, internet providers, or service providers.
And wireless carrier.
AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile basically control the entire carrier industry.
Wireless carriers.
And part of it may be designed by a structure, because they have to compete for government contracts over controlling certain network segments or bandwidths. But beyond that, also perhaps, for instance, that's one of the barriers to entry. Another barrier to entry could be they are economy of scale in the long run. So they have such high startup costs.
They're all very big companies, and actually recently T-Mobile just merged with Sprint, so we are left with 3 really big players with massive economic scale. So the barrier is really high.
We see that merger becomes more consolidation in our industry. That is a very big theme right now in American economics. And for an oligopoly in the short and long run, basically it's the same concept of pricing production at where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, MR equals MC. However, and there's a separate marginal revenue curve from the demand curve, as seen with the monopolistic competition and with monopoly. What we see here, demand curve, it looks very jagged, or looks very uneven. Now, of course, we learned that in the demand curve, at one point, there's going to be an elastic part of demand curve and an inelastic part of demand curve that's separated by a certain point. And in this point, we have an elastic part of demand curve for an oligopoly firm. As we know, oligopolies are, each firm is a very powerful price maker. They have pricing power, so they have an elastic part of their demand curve where they can basically control pricing. And that also is reflected in this marginal revenue curve. That's based off demand curve. However, at the point of inflection right here, beyond that, we have a very inelastic demand curve. The reason for that, we have a price match war. Remember, oligopolistic firms are not only price makers, but they're also price interdependent of each other. And just interdependent in general by behavior. Because let's say you're Coca-Cola and you want to produce past the price match war point in quantity. You want to produce more past that quantity. Well, at that point, you take up too much of the market share or two series of competitor for let's say Pepsi to bear with. And so Pepsi needs to compete with you more heavily through pricing. So let's say Coca-Cola, you decrease your prices to $1 per can in order to produce past a certain quantity. Well, Pepsi wants to directly compete with you by making their cans 99 cents each, by matching your price and having that price war with you in order to meet or match or limit your production and to also or to produce just as much, if not more than you. And so we see this price war happen between interdependent oligopolistic firms because there are so few firms in the industry. Each firm is so powerful.
Actually, the price war happens very often. If we look at the history, we know that T-Mobile often launched a price war in the wireless, carrier industry, and usually Verizon and AT&T will follow up with to match the whatever T-Mobile offers, not just the price, maybe some contents, and very quickly catch up so that they can actually keep their own customers. So that's a very unique part because on the oligopoly demand and supply curve, we can see a very distinct deflection point on the demand curve, and actually marginal revenue collapsed. Based on this price match war, right? So because there's pricing without any discrimination, everyone gets the same price, right? So and at this time point, we can see most likely the marginal cost and the marginal revenue actually will cross at that vertical point. So that means most likely the oligopoly, the optimal operating condition is they go back to the original quantity before the price war. So that everyone keeps their massive economic profit. Remember, not just T-Mobile, not just Coca-Cola or Verizon face this demand and supply curve, cost and cost curve, but also T-Mobile or Pepsi, they face the same. Very similar one.
Here, because of that, it's very difficult to increase quantity produced by a very large amount past a price match or point, because no matter how much you lower the price, other companies in the oligopolistic industry will steal your output or market share because they'll just match your price. And so we see here, as a result, at the price match point of inflection, we're going to see a very large drop in marginal revenue as well, which correlates and makes sense. And so usually we produce at the same point where the point of inflection is to avoid or just avoid that price match war. That's very harmful to profits and very unproductive in terms of the quantity produced. And so because of that, each corporation or firm in the industry basically have the same economic circumstances as each other. So they each produce a certain amount of profit, and they don't really change that amount of profit in the long run.
They preserve their own economic profit by reducing the output, by getting higher pricing, right? So it sounds very much like a monopoly, right?
But however, there are ways for instance, collusion, which is typically illegal but still happens. Collusion, basically, where each firm either informally or formally agrees to produce a certain amount at a certain fixed price, to predetermined price, to avoid or surpass that price match war. Where they basically agree not to basically have a price war, or not to compete each other through price, but to already predetermine each other's prices and output in order to maximize profits further.
That makes our free market not free anymore, right?
And so for final clues, oligopolies have a very few big producers with unique pricing powers, but they're interdependent. Economic scale is usually their biggest barrier because in the long run, if you're in economy of scale, then existing large firms have an advantage because they actually have lower long-range output costs than their smaller firm that's just starting out at lower quantity produced. Because that initial or initial average total cost is very high.
Yeah, just like for example, Coca-Cola, the economic scale is so big because of the distribution network.
Yeah.
Okay, and it probably has so massive. It's probably the most comprehensive or most complicated distribution network in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so any new soda wanna get into the soda market, it will be very difficult to match. Okay, so.
There's short and long-run positive economic profit even under a price war because of the deflected demand curve that kind of fixed each firm in its current position. But they can avoid this point deflection or this price war through collusion, such as cartels like the OPEC, which basically controlled each member country's production points and pricing levels to maximize each country's economic profit.
Yeah, of course.
You can see this through graphics. Graphics are very important.
Yeah, so we again want to stress the importance of graphics, okay, particularly in microeconomics, because this really helps you to understand the concepts and all the reasons behind those economic behaviors for different companies. Right. Okay, see you next time. Bye bye.